At this time of year, late winter, is the time to be thinking about propagating. There's a lot of different ways to propagate, but the simplest way is taking cuttings for those plants that suit growing from cuttings. And so in preparation for doing a goodly number of cuttings, a great thing to do is to prepare your cuttings bed. That is, clear some area in your garden that's suitable for cutting production. The things you need to look for are good, friable, well-drained soil and some shade. Cuttings don't do so well when they're put out in the open sun or in soil that's too heavy. So this area here I've cultivated the size of about a couple of double beds, and that's going to be able to contain a lot of cuttings. And I've started already. You can see over here that I've put in cuttings from trees such as elder, buddleia, flowering currant, but particularly this year I've focused on the berry fruits, the gooseberries, blackberries, black currants, white currants, red currants and so on. They're very easy to propagate from cuttings, and that's been my focus so far. The cuttings that I take are generally about a foot in length, or what would you call that, 30 centimetres. So with this cutting I have yet to take off the very tip. The idea with doing that is that this growth tip at the end, which would like to carry on up into the sky, has been curtailed, and the growth will then come from these side shoots, which will mean that the eventual plant from this cutting will be well branched. The final preparation for this cutting will be to take off this tip at the end here, so that the growing tip has been taken away, but what's left behind are these side shoots, which will mean as the plant develops it'll be much better branched. And to do that, I'm going to simply cut on an angle just above that bud. So once the tip of the cutting has been processed, then it's the other end we need to think about, and that's the end that's in the ground, and there I've already made the cutting when I took it off the bush. When you're taking the cutting originally from the bush, the cut is made just below a bud. The reason for that is that around that bud there are some very active growth cells. These are buddleia, and the cuttings I've done slightly differently in that I haven't taken off the growth tips. I've done them fairly simply, just a quick cut from the parent bush. I've stripped off the bottom leaves from the cutting and then pushed the whole cutting into the ground, and in the case of buddleia, that's enough. Buddleia grows very freely and easily and doesn't require much treatment. It's a little bit like willow. When you put it in the ground, it'll do everything you want it to do without you fussing much about it at all. Willow is probably the easiest plant of all to take cuttings from or to propagate from. This length of willow here is from one of the basket willows. It's the thickest of the basket willows, and I've grown and am growing a lot of those. But this length of willow here, which is just a single year's growth from where I'd pruned them last year, can actually provide enough material for probably 10 segments of cutting, all of which will take easily and grow into new willow trees. To do that is simply a matter of following the formula of cutting just below the bud at the base of the cutting, and then making the second cut just above on a slight angle the top bud. That leaving you with a segment of cutting about 30 centimetres long, which can just be pushed into the ground. And in the case of willow, it's already started growing. It's the simplest of all plants to grow. The cells and all along underneath the bark of the willow are all capable of making roots, and they'll do that. This longer piece will provide us with enough cuttings for perhaps 8 more willow trees, all of which will most likely grow without any effort at all, and really rapidly multiplying your store of trees. The very last piece I don't use usually. It's getting quite thin. The willow I tend not to use at all. It's getting rather thin and very buddy, so I'll discard that. These ones, however, can just go into the ground as easily as that, and they're just left alone for the next 2 or 3 months, after which I'll dig underneath them with a fork and lift the whole lot up and check to see how many roots they've produced. I'm pretty confident they'll be fully rooted. Willow's a very useful plant to grow, in part because they can be used for making fences or hurdles, and this hurdle over here has been woven using willow for the horizontal form with hazel rods for the upright. These hazel rods here I cut from a copse in my garden, and you can see they're of a good size, and the way to get them this size and this straightness is by coppicing the copse. This coppice or clump of hazel has been worked on by me for the last few years, and you can see some of these stumps here were quite big. They've all been cut off, and to do that I used one of these silky pruning saws. Are so sharp and effective and able to get right in amongst the growth of a copse like this. The reason for doing this, for cutting down the hazel, which otherwise would have been left to grow into a full-sized hazel tree if you're collecting nuts from them, is that I'm not collecting nuts from this particular stand of hazel. I'm growing branches for it for the purposes that I was describing before. This branch here is at this point suitable for cutting in this pruning saw, and cutting as low as I can possibly get at the base of this branch. Easy cutting and taking off the wand now, leaving behind the small stump which will perhaps even put out new sprouts itself in the following year, as this one here shows. I'll take this wand away and remove the side branches and store it. Storing them on the ground is sufficient. They don't want to be high and dry. They need to store naturally so that they don't split. So removing the very top of it leaves me with a very nice stave or wand there that's got so many different uses. So hazel's a terrific plant to grow in the garden, and that under that coppicing system that will be a useful resource for decades. This time of year is a great time for planting fruit trees, particularly bare-rooted ones like this. It doesn't look as though they've got a great deal of root on them, and you might think, well, how's that ever going to support the size of the tree above it? But it does. This time of year, bare root fruit tree planting is the thing to do. Simple enough process. Choose your tree, find a good spot to put it in, such as the one I have here, and dig a hole. I like to dig with a small-headed but very sharp spade, like this one, clearing away any growth to begin with, and then just cultivating by chopping up the soil and make it nice and fine. Here I'm going through some bulbs, but it doesn't matter. A fruit tree can share the space with other plants. I'll take soil out with the spade, but then use my hands. The shape of the planting hole is important. It should be round. The sides need to be roughened up or loosened so that the roots of the tree, as they grow, don't follow around and around and around the edges of a tightly cut hole. It needs to be loose enough for the roots to get out and through into the wider world. The centre of the hole needs to be formed into a small hillock or a hill or a lump, because the roots of the apple tree need to be heading in toward the centre of the earth rather than being either running flat or being curved up at the edges. So this little mound in the middle for me is a very important part of tree planting. I'm going to take the tree with its roots and spread those out over this mound and then backfill in with the soil that I took out earlier on. I'm not adding anything new to the soil, no fertilisers, no sheep manures, no potting mix, because the tree needs to start off in the same quality and type of soil that it's going to grow in from this point on. And I'm pressing the soil down around those roots just with my fingers, not with my boot or with the back of a spade. That's enough, that's sufficient pressure to hold the tree in place. I'm also taking care not to plant the tree any deeper than it was when it was growing in the nursery bed. The bark higher up the tree here is designed to be above the ground. And if you plant it too deeply with the soil pressing around that bark, it'll cause it to rot. It'll suffer from a disease called collar rot, and your tree will die. Some plants, for example tomatoes, you can plant more deeply, but a tree with its particular kind of bark has to go in at exactly the level that it was grown in the nursery. Once the tree is pressed firmly in and looks secure, then we have to think about the top end of the tree and do some pruning. And while it might seem harsh to make what seems like an already small tree even smaller, with apples you must prune when you plant. A lot of people would think, oh, it's just a small thing, let's let it go and give it its head and see what it does, but it's always the wrong thing to do. It never succeeds. The tree gets too lanky, tall and whippy. So what I'm going to do now with my secateurs is prune these two very thin branches. For a person who's just bought a very slender and young apple tree like this, the idea of cutting it in half can be a bit frightening, but I can reassure any owner of a new apple tree, it has to be pruned in the first year. The reason being, if you don't prune in the first year, the growth is going to be dominated by these these points right at the very top of the branch, and they'll encourage the branch just to continue to grow higher and higher and higher. It's not useful as an apple tree owner. You want your apple tree to branch. The secret of pruning is buds. As soon as you understand what a bud does and what its purpose is, then you'll be an enabled pruner. There are buds right up the length of this sapling here. Each of those buds is capable of either becoming a branch or a fruiting bud. At this stage in the tree's life, we want these to be branching buds. We want the tree to branch, not fruit at this stage. There are buds all around the sapling here, but the one I want to focus on is the one that points away from the centre of the tree, both on this side and on any other branch that might happen to be growing. When I prune, I'm going to prune just above that bud on a slight angle, so that once I've cut it and taken off the top piece of the branch, this bud becomes the dominant bud. This bud is the one that will tell everything else in the tree what to do, and its direction is outward. This bud on the other branch likewise is pointing away from the centre of the tree, so if I cut just above that, it will encourage that bud to become a branch bud, and that branch will come out this way. The cut I've made very close to the bud, but not so close as to touch it, but it's also on an angle away from the bud, so that any water that falls, raindrops or moisture that might gather there, will slide off and won't run down into the bud and rot it. There's no need to seal off these cuts. They're so small that the tree will seal them off themselves very rapidly. If we were making a much larger cut in a bigger tree, we might need to apply some kind of paste to stop organisms, fungus and so on getting into that cut. But with a very young tree like this, it's just a matter of cutting and moving on, and it'll seal itself up. This pruning to an outside bud in this first year of this tree's life has to be repeated year after year after year for as long as you can bear to do it, or as long as you can reach the buds at the top of the tree. What it does is it creates a framework. The most important thing about the first year of your apple tree's life is to create a framework. We prune to a wine glass or a vase style of fruit tree. Some people prune to a Christmas style tree, which is different from what I've demonstrated here, but we find for the home garden this is the most successful way of doing it. It looks good, it's easy to pick, and it fits well into a mixed orchard area such as we have here.